Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now, today I'm really excited to be speaking with Dr Josie Perry. Josie, great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Super awesome that you can join us today. Why don't we get started by having you introduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience, Josie?
Cool. I'm Josie. I am a sports psychologist and I guess author a little bit. So most of my work day to day is working one-to-one with athletes, but I also do lots of kind of workshops, and then I do lots of writing. So I write features for magazines like Cycling Weekly, and I've written 3 books on sports psychology.
Cool. And you had a prominent career prior to being a sports psychologist, didn't you?
Yeah, so for 15 years I worked in communications. So I actually began as a freelance journalist on the news desk of an American TV network, which was amazing. And then I moved into PR, and kind of my first proper PR job couldn't have been fluffier. So I worked on the press office for Kellogg's, writing press releases on behalf of Tony the Tiger. And then gradually moved through that kind of PR communications career. I always say my last grown-up job was director of communications at a large health charity.
And as a sports psychologist, do you feel that your former career as an expert in communications has helped you at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's really helped on the promotion side to be able to build up a business from scratch. But I also find it really helps when working with athletes, and particularly helping athletes develop better relationships with the other people that are there to support them. So particularly kind of how to talk to their parents and how to get what they need, and also sometimes actually working with the parents to help them communicate better with their children. And then also how to handle coaches much better. One of the things we use a lot in communication is always thinking about your audience first. What do you want your audience to come away from that conversation or that thing that they've watched thinking or doing? And if we can help athletes see that, they can be much more effective in their communications with coaches or with other people.
And I suppose, as you were saying that, I was thinking about that's got to help. That sort of philosophy has got to help coaches, rather than the coach being stuck inside his or her head, what I want to do, thinking more towards what does this person or these people in front of me want or need is possibly a more pragmatic starting point than what's in your own head, essentially.
Yeah, and I see so many of the stresses that or the stressors that athletes have to handle come from poor communication from both them and their coaches. So a really interesting example I observed was an athlete in a team where it felt very hierarchical. How you did and the Wednesday training session meant what position you got for a Saturday. It was in rowing for a Saturday race. And when the boats come out and where people are racing came out, and if somebody's in a lower boat, that person, that athlete, instantly feels like they failed. They feel like the coaches are against them. Why hasn't the effort they've put in been rewarded? What's going on? A short conversation with a coach would see that actually the water is really rough right now. They don't want a novice boat out. They need some really strong rowers out with that boat. It's actually a compliment. But the coach hasn't explained that to the athlete, and the athlete takes it as they hate me. They think I'm failing. They think I'm not a good athlete. And actually one simple short conversation would make both of them a lot happier. And that kind of stuff I see so often. And when we kind of coach athletes into how to go and talk to coaches without confrontation, to go and ask advice and questions and explain why they need to know those questions, rather than it feeling like their respect is being undermined, they lose so much of that stress instantly.
makes me think of three things, Josie. It makes me think of psychosocial is always happening. As Dr. Fergus Connolly said on this show once, psychosocial is omnipresent, or psychology is omnipresent. It's always there. So psychosocial is always happening. That as a coach, never assume anything. Never assume that everyone's happy or confident or relaxed or focused. And as a participant, as a player, it makes me think of being brave enough to go and have a conversation with your coach, being confident enough, building the confidence to communicate with your coach.
We often build that into goal setting plans, of actually purposely building that relationship and doing it early over smaller things, so that when a big thing comes up, you feel confident enough to be able to go and ask what's going on, and not questioning things necessarily, but what could I do to improve this? So that the coach knows that you as an athlete are really serious about it, but you can also learn, have that conversation, and handle any of those worries before they really hit you.
Is that something that you build in, irrespective of your client's needs? Like, is that something that you preempt that will be required anyway, more often than not? Or is it really only when you feel that clients need a boost of confidence?
I think having a good relationship with your coach is never going to be a bad thing. And something that really struck me when I was writing I Can, the book for teenage athletes, I interviewed 10 elite, either current or retired athletes. One thing that struck me that they all said they did was ask loads of questions.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them in particular, actually, Emma Wiggs, who's an amazing paracanoeist, she was talking about when she sits on the start line, she's never thought she was going to win a race. She's never had that, I will win this. I was like, but that's crazy. You're the Paralympic champion. You got gold medal at Rio. You've won 8 world titles. How do you not have any of that confidence? She went, well, I've kind of cultivated confidence in a different way. She said, when I sit on that start line, I may not think I'm going to win it, but I do know I've worked harder than any other athlete to get there. I have done every single training possible. I've done all my rehab. I've asked every question you could ever ask of the coach, and I've eaten more cottage cheese than any other person has ever eaten. And I love that because it's that real cultivated confidence that she may not have the arrogance of thinking, yes, I'm going to beat everybody, but she knows she's put her heart and soul and everything into it. But it was that she also knows in her team, she asks more questions than anybody else does. But that means she can really kind of suck up that knowledge and use it in a way that was going to make her faster in the boat.
You mentioned your book, your new book, I Can, there. And that's what we're going to go through today. I've got it sitting proudly in front of me here. I love the title, I Can. Subtitle being The Teenage Athlete's Guide to Mental Fitness. You've got a wonderful endorsement from Amy Williams, who's an Olympic champion, saying the mental aspect of high performance sports is incredibly important and often overlooked. Josie Perry has put together this fantastic resource for young athletes, and I'd strongly recommend them to read it and incorporate the many lessons from it. I'd have loved to have had this as a teenager. And I completely agree. I would have loved to have had this book, Josie. It's absolutely fantastic. And as I say, the title encapsulates the kind of attitude you'd love young people to enjoy. Tell me a little bit about the history of this book. When did you start considering writing a book for young athletes? Where did this all come from?
So I work a lot with young athletes. I've written 2 books before, but one was much more for coaches and trainee sports psychologists. So it was very technical, full of references, very grown-up book, which had great feedback, but it's not something you'd use day to day if you're an athlete. And then my second book was on the psychology of exercise, some much more theory-driven, which I wrote because I felt like I'd kind of skipped that stuff when I did my master's, and I felt a little bit lacking because I was so interested in the sports side. And it felt like it was an area I really ought to do a lot more research into. And then actually, all kudos for this, it came from my publisher. He contacted me and said, I think there's a really big gap in the market here, and I think you would be the person to write it. I was a bit like, oh, I'm not sure. And then the more I started thinking about it and the more I noticed myself taking notes and kind of, oh, this would work brilliantly. And then I'm also hyper aware that as a sports psych, I think I'm quite cheap. Many people can't afford that. That feels a lot when you might be paying out for coaching or nutrition and strength and conditioning and everything else that kids are doing. And I think a lot of the time we don't necessarily need lots of one-to-one work, but we do need to know these basic skills. And I would love to see these skills all taught in schools. Because if we're teaching kids how the basics of how their brain works when you're under threat or you're stressed or you're angry, and teach them ways to manage that and to get more emotional control, because schools are going to be easier to run, but you're also going to have kids coming out that can handle anything, not just their sports, but they can handle exams or interviews or difficult situations in life. So it suddenly made a lot of sense to kind of pull it all into one place. And I like the visual side of sports psychology. That's why it's full of worksheets and full of questions, because actually I wanted a book that is scribbled all over with notes, because it's much more user friendly, and you might think something and it feel like a genius light bulb moment, but half an hour later you've forgotten it because you're onto the Netflix program or something else has happened. So having some way that you can tap it all down and be all in one place, I thought would be really helpful.
Well, you use that term "I can" for every single chapter. And chapter 1 is "I can be successful." And I'm going to make the presumption here that you spin the notion of "I can be successful," that it's not all about winning. But tell us a little bit about "I can be successful."
You have made a very good presumption. Not only is it not all about winning, I try to make the point it's not at all about winning. For two perspectives. One is sport, exercise, physical movement is vital for us as human beings for a myriad of reasons. And if we turn it into something that is all about winning, that means a huge number of people drop out. And we see massive dropout rates, even younger than we really started to think. We thought it was all about 13, 14. We actually start to see dropout rates coming as young as 7 or 8. And so when we make it about winning, the fun goes. It's not just about playing with your friends anymore. It's about we must do it in a certain way. And that just sucks all the joy out of sport. And so many people come to see me as adults who say, well, I stopped sport at school because it got so competitive and it was all about winning. And I really feel like I missed out. So for that reason, we don't want people thinking about winning. We want them to think about all the stuff they actually love and the stuff that matters to them. Winning's quite a blunt metric, but actually if we can have metrics that really matter to us, we can enjoy what we do much more and still develop. But I also don't want people thinking about winning, because when we focus on the outcomes, we tend to screw up what we're actually doing. And I love the case study we used for chapter 1, which is a friend of mine who's amazing, called Kath Bishop. And she's actually got a brilliant book out called The Long Win, which is pretty similar subject.
We've spoken about it on the show. Yeah, it's awesome, isn't it?
Cool. And Kath talks about it really well in that when she went to her first 2 Olympics, they were focused on winning. Everything at GB rowing then was you must win, and they didn't. And so she had her 3rd Olympics coming up, which was at Athens. And she and Kath Granger, that she was in the boat with, focused on the idea of what is possible. That's all. It wasn't about we must win. It's what is possible. And so she'd be like, what's possible between the heats and the finals? What's possible in the temperature that we're in? What's possible with the boat that we've got or the body shapes we've got? And so they focused on what's possible at this moment. And she was saying if she was at 50 metres and she started thinking about 1,500 metres, all she was likely to do was catch a crab, and there's no way you're going to do well at that point. And so she could just be focused on that moment, never on the outcome, just on what can I do to be the very best rower at this moment. And that was when they got their silver medal. So her most successful games came from not trying to win. And I see with athletes, the more we focus on that, of finding the love of it, of being brilliant at it, and moving our head away from outcomes, fabulous.
It's fascinating, isn't it, Josie? In as much as, this is a book for kids. You're aiming this at kids, at teenagers, at young adults, perhaps. And here we are talking about, or you're referring to, an Olympic medalist who, to be able to succeed in what she was doing, had to revert back to that sort of childhood mentality, or perceived childhood mentality, of intrinsic motivation, joy, experience, mastery, uh, values, aligning her identity with those kind of intrinsic factors, intrinsic drivers for those kind of intrinsic rewards. I do wonder sometimes, Josie, if every parent and every adult coach understood that, more often than not, at the very highest level, at the adult elite level, at the professional level, um, if they understood that these intrinsic motivators were, are the optimal motivators, that actually they wouldn't force younger players to have extrinsic or external drivers and extrinsic motivators.
I recently had a coach say to me that they'd really been working with a young athlete who, I think it was in triathlon. They were very new to
Mm.
cycling, and they'd been working so hard with this athlete on cycling. And they did their first race, and they were super, super excited about how well they'd done, and the fact they'd really made a huge leap, a big development. But the first thing the parents said to the kid when they finished was, "Why didn't you win?" And you can just see all of that hard work that the coaches have been working on about development and getting better at what you do and not focusing on outcome gets undone very, very quickly when a parent starts focusing on, did you win? And I spent a lot of time with athletes of all ages, actually, really working out. I guess this comes from the communications background. How do you control your own narrative around your sport? So, for example, maybe golfers will go in the clubhouse after a round, and the first thing that's said in the changing room was, "What was your score?" Or "How was it out there?" And we interpret that as, I must tell them my score. And suddenly that, if it's not been great, becomes a threat. Whereas if you decide your narrative about the round you had that day was, "Oh, it was so lovely to be out there again. It just makes me feel like a whole new person." Then you've moved away from having to focus on metrics that don't really matter, like a score, and you've taken it into the things that do matter and you'd rather talk about. So you get to take control over how people are forcing you to think in a certain way.
And it's interesting, Josie. I mean, you've spoken about golf there, and obviously my background is pro golf, so I have some reasonable knowledge within that sport. In my work with golfers now, I actually force myself to not look at, let's say, the European or the US Tour apps to see what my clients have shot, because I don't want my feelings, emotions, thoughts skewing my communication. I want to make sure that I'm keeping it on point with regard our feedback loops around mindset, feedback loops around experience, rather than outcome.
And you have to keep yourself in check, don't you? Because it would be so much easier when you start a conversation with somebody of, what was the score? Or to focus on the good stuff. So somebody suddenly got, I don't know, number one in Europe. You kind of want to celebrate that with them because it's a big thing for them. But you also, on the other hand, don't want to make that metric, which shouldn't be the thing that's important, too important. So you're constantly on that balance of trying to keep them focused on the right things and trying to show those other things are what really matters. But it would be very easy to get carried away and focus on the things that are very easy to celebrate.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I nodded at you there because it's like, if somebody does really, really well, let's say again in golf, they shoot a great score. You jump on WhatsApp and go, "Oh, great score, mate! Well done, awesome." what do you do when they've had a bad score?
Yes.
You know, do you immediately jump on WhatsApp and commiserate with them? Well, maybe that is what you do. Maybe that's part of an agreement of a relationship. You know, there are all kinds of relationships you can have, you know, with your clients as a sports psychologist, and maybe that's part of the process of laying down some ground rules. But it's it's just that two-way feedback is quite interesting, and striving to come away from the usual judgments that people have, and actually setting up you know, feedback and communication around more adaptive indices of success, I think is
Yeah.
vital.
Something I picked up from my supervisor when I did my stage 2 training. I was very lucky I had Tim Holder as my
Yep.
supervisor. And whenever I did kind of post event analysis with athletes, he was very clear that when we looked at what they had done well, we would look equally at what they hadn't done so well, what they didn't feel so good about. But equally, when they'd had an awful competition, there would have to be as many positives that they would pull from it as negatives. And so that helped, I think, really get that balance of, we're looking at performance overall, we're looking at the efforts you put in rather than just those outcomes.
Is it something that, I don't want to dwell on this too long because we've got a whole book to get through, and there's so many little gems in here that I want to talk about. But is it something that you talk with coaches about? Because again, it's tougher for coaches, isn't it? Because I suppose the performance is so much more relevant. The quality of the performance, the standard, the style of the performance is I suppose, at the front and center of what the coach has to communicate with a player about. And yet we want that coach to perhaps maintain a mastery climate. We want them to maintain the emotional temperature in the room and with the client. Uh, and so what we're talking about now seems relevant for coach-athlete relationships, coach-athlete communications.
Yeah, I mean, the coaches I feel really harshly for are usually the US coaches in colleges. And this is something I would do a lot of work with if we've got an athlete going over on scholarship to an American uni, of really helping them understand this might be their goals. Their goals overall might be an England vest for something. But the US coach needs, in order to keep their job, certain results. And so they will have a very different pull on their focus, and to almost inoculate the athlete a little bit to understand that their coach doesn't necessarily need to will be working in the same way that the athlete will be working, because they have very different outcomes and goals. But what really cheers me actually is I have had lots of coaches and some schools as well recently who have asked me to do workshops with their PE departments to really help them focus on that mastery side, as you said. And so, how do they make sure the kids who are naturally good at sports stay in the sports because they don't fall out of love with it? But also, how do they use that mastery more to really engage the kids that don't necessarily feel that they're sporty?
Chapter 2, I can handle my nerves. Talk to me about that. It's interesting for me because when I reflect back as a teenager, you know what, Josie, I used to get really, really nervous. You know, we talk about in psychology trait and state anxiety, and God, my state anxiety when it came to golf was really quite crippling. Is a strong word, but it definitely was a challenge for me. So tell me a little bit about this chapter. I can handle my nerves. What approach do you take here?
So, I would say this is probably the area I get called up most by parents to help younger athletes with. That
Yeah.
they won't even get in the car to go to training or to races or to competitions. They are an absolute mess when they get there. They don't want to talk to me. We end up fighting. I can see it's just nerves. And sometimes I work with parents on this rather than the children, of how can I be a better parent to them in this moment, because I feel like I'm failing here. I want them to enjoy this. I really want them just to have fun with this, and they're taking it way too seriously. Um, so a lot of this is some education about what's going on in their brain,
Hmm.
but also just some tactics to really, really help them focus on the tasks, and again, not focus on the outcome. So I think I talk about it as focusing on the target and not the trophy. And so there's lots of things we use within it. One, helping them understand a lot of their stresses that they might have in life, and that the more stresses they've got going on, the harder it's going to be to handle whatever's ahead of you that you're a bit nervous about. We do lots of breathing exercises. And one I love that I think can be really effective for kids is to learn where their stress zone is. And this is actually one I learnt doing eating disorder training. So we use it a lot within eating disorders to learn how to feel our body more and what our body is telling us. But we just do a very simple breathing exercise, but bring in the last time they felt really anxious or nervous before a competition, and notice where in your body you feel it. So I know mine is my bottom right-hand side of my stomach. If that starts throbbing, I am anxious about something, and I literally go to my diary and I'm look through going, what's coming up that I haven't bothered to prepare properly for? What is causing me that anxiety? A lot of athletes will get it over their shoulders and that stress, and then almost have that light bulb moment of, oh, I see what this is telling me. And it's like, well, if you can notice you're getting anxious really early, we can put in place more of these activities to do it. We'll do lots of things around music, which obviously teenagers love to do. And me as a middle-aged mum really likes to actually know what I'm supposed to be listening to as well. So it's quite handy to get that kind of guidance. Not all of that I should be listening to be honest. We do lots of stuff about kind of pre-performance bubbles. What's your ideal place to get into beforehand? And then lots of things about how do you move from those feelings, feeling like a threat, into more of a challenge. So yeah, lots of breathing exercise, different coping mechanisms you might have. And then lots of things around pre-performance routines, so you can feel really, really well prepared. An example I always use with them that I heard Vicky Holland, the triathlete, talking about after Rio Olympics, of where she literally minute by minute, the morning of her race, had every single element she was doing. So what time she was having a shower, what she was having for breakfast, what time she would pump up her tyres. And because it was so regulated and she was so task focused, she talks about how she could stand on the start line on the beach and just know whatever happened, that was okay, because she'd taken everything she possibly could to that start line. And I find teenagers really get that, of kind of, it helps with that success is more important than winning element, that even if something goes wrong in that race or an event, knowing you've done whatever you could means you can still come out feeling proud of yourself. So we do lots of elements, and that does help to control those nerves a bit.
I love the chapter. It's full of techniques. What I love about what you've been talking about there especially is this notion of tuning into your body, becoming body literate, I suppose, intelligent about your body. I think probably not just as teenagers but as adults as well, we don't necessarily go about doing that. We're not taught to do that. That's not something in any kind of curriculum or syllabus, and yet we tend to be a slave to our bodily feelings, which I suppose is where nerves really impact. And it's interesting you said about your thigh there. I would certainly say nerves come from my chest, which I would imagine is quite common, and conversely, this is very strange, and I've probably never said this to anybody, but when I reflect back on my golf, the rare times, Josie, I was really confident on the golf course and actually ripping it down the middle of the fairway onto the green and holding the putt, I felt at one with the target, and it was my back. It was like my upper back felt at one with the target. So that's I think that's a subjective experience that only I could possibly tune into. But my point being is, I think the more into our bodies we can become without being over analytical, the more body literate we can become, the more aware we can become and acquainted with the bodies we can become, the more intelligent we could potentially play, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I love using biodots with my athletes.
Oh, tell me about that.
So I think they're probably the modern equivalent of the mood rings we all had when we were kind of teenagers that changed colour depending on how kind of angry you were.
Mm.
But it is literally a little sticker that you will stick on your hand. And when you start to get anxious or stressed, it will change colour. And then the job we give the athlete is to use their breathing techniques to get it back down to a gentle green. And it's a really nice way of them visually seeing that the breathing technique works. And you only need to do it a couple of times because then they know that it works and they can bring it in when they're on the course or the pitch. But the visual elements and the more activities you can do with younger athletes, the much more it tends to stick.
Well, it makes it tangible, doesn't it? I'm just thinking there, it just makes it more tangible.
Yeah, so I give my younger athletes, when we work on the kind of emotional control side, I use the chimp analogies taken from Steve Peters. And I find that really works for people. With really young athletes, we'll actually get them to draw their chimp. Everybody names their chimp. We all look at what triggers our chimp. But I also give the athletes a little chimp keyring. And when you press the keyring's head, it squeals and its eyes light up. And it's just such a cool way that they remember. A lot of them will keep them on their golf bags or their kit bags. But when they notice their chimp is starting to come up, it's a really nice trigger of like, I'm noticing it. That means I can get on board and handle it much quicker than letting it run away with me and causing a lot of trouble.
I seem to remember having an ape on the golf course rather than a chimp. It was just going bananas all the time. Hey, look, chapter 3, I can improve. Tell me a little bit about this chapter, Josie.
So this is often because I get athletes saying, I want to be braver. I want to feel like it's okay to push really hard, that it's hard. You don't want to put anyone in pain, but in order to improve, sometimes you have to be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And you almost have to embrace that discomfort rather than trying to push it away. And I think this comes down a lot to the kind of approaches I use. So like most sports psychs that you're taught in uni, you start using a very CBT kind of approach. But actually, almost all the work I really do now is through ACT. And I'm really looking to, rather than trying to push away those worrisome thoughts, embrace them much more, but use your values to really understand why you're okay to do it anyway. And I think younger athletes really do get this too. So a lot of it is about kind of, yes, you're going to be uncomfortable at times, either mentally uncomfortable, having to go and talk to a coach that scares you, or physically uncomfortable about having to push yourself into a place that your body's kind of shouting at you not to. But some approaches on how you increase your motivation so that you're up for doing that. But also try and make it feel a little bit easier. So really simple techniques. I love the work that's been done on smiling. So that when you smile, when you're exercising, it tricks your brain into thinking what you're doing is a little bit easier. You're putting less effort in than you are. And so really simple things. We use that a lot in marathon running. Smile every mile. Every time you go past the mile marker, you smile. The nice element is somebody in the crowd will normally smile back at you. And you get this really nice kind of circular action of just feeling better about what you're doing. So lots of elements in this chapter are about increasing your motivation and then making it feel easier.
I seem to be grimacing every time I run, so I might have to adopt that. I agree, and I think sometimes, especially with, I think physiological triggers are really, really useful. Certainly, I find in my work, Josie, and again, coming back to that notion of perhaps sometimes in some of our work, from some people, we can be accused of being a bit fluffy, but I wonder if I do find those physiological triggers, holding your body in a certain way, which I think you've got later in the book and we'll come on to, but holding yourself in a certain way, it directs attention differently. It helps you interpret a situation differently. It changes your lived experience of that moment. So I find it in my work really effective.
Mm.
chapter 4, I can be confident.
Yeah.
And I think this is actually where you talk about, the power of the body and actually acting confident or being confident to become confident. Tell me a little bit about confidence for young athletes.
Yeah, so we talk about, so in the book, we've kind of got a quiz so you can work out where your level of confidence is.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting. I work on a program for British athletics where we look at kind of 17-year-olds coming up through. They're all very high on the power of 10 for their events, and where they get a phenomenal range of support to kind of help them if this is where they want to go with their careers. And in the very first session, when we sit down with them as psychologists to look at where they want to get to, we ask where their confidence levels are right now and where they would like to get to. And all of them go 10 out of 10. And I was a bit like, do you really want to be 10 out of 10? Because 10 out of 10 confidence to me implies that you can rock up to the start line or onto the pitch and you'll be absolutely sorted. But actually, if you were maybe an 8, an 8.5, you'd still have that little bit of doubt in the back of your mind that would mean you have done all the training you needed to do. You have done all the mental skills that we've taught you, that you have worked really hard on your support systems and on your nutrition and your strength and conditioning. And maybe we want that tiny little bit of doubt that means you're going to keep pushing harder if you want to be the best athlete you can be. If it's purely for enjoyment and you genuinely don't care about the score or the outcome or whether you want to be a brilliant athlete, then go for it. Overconfidence is fine. But if you're trying to be the very best athlete you can be, actually maybe you need a few doubts. But actually that's quite rare. Most people come with no way near enough confidence. And so we do start by faking it, of kind of, and you can do this practicing in a room with lots of you, especially if the coach is there, of trying to get younger athletes to practice different emotions and different stances. And the more emotional literacy you can give young athletes, the better they can handle lots of different things, the right coping mechanisms they can develop. So I think it's a really helpful thing to do, of kind of getting your body to act out what you should be doing. And then we've got my favourite activity that I really, really love. So in here it's a confidence jar. But I find this works across the board, whatever your age, whatever world you're in. I did some free workshops over lockdown to kind of give some skills that people might use to handle lockdown better, but also to be better athletes on the other side. And the confidence jar was part of this. And I had so many teachers emailing me afterwards saying, I'm going to do this in my class. Because it's just such a nice way. We use 25 sheets of paper, a jar, whatever you want, jam jar, and you write down 25 things that are great about you. And they're usually things like achievements you're proud of, setbacks that you handled, strengths you've noticed, challenges you overcame, compliments from people you respect. And often we'll do that in workshops and we'll get the coach to give everybody a compliment. And you just see their faces light up that somebody said something really nice about them. It's really lovely to see. Tricky skills you've learned. And the one that everybody struggles with, particularly if they're British, are things you love about yourself. And they hate it, but they walk out of the room buzzing. Because instead of having those negative thoughts rolling around in their head, they've got a little jar of all the really awesome stuff about themselves. And I really love it when I see my athletes sending me photos from like random hotel rooms around the world, but with their little confidence jar on their bedside table, because they know they can look at it before they go into competition and remember everything they've put in.
We spoke to Dr. Nicole Gabana, episode 132. We talked at length about gratitude, and it seems to align nicely with what you're talking about there.
Yeah.
That being identifying, becoming aware, identifying your skills, your aptitudes, your abilities, your capabilities, your successes, your strengths, and so on, and then perhaps building on that by being grateful for those things as well. Sort of double whammy there.
Yeah. And my new book's got an entire chapter on gratitude. It was when I started researching it, I realised the evidence behind it is phenomenal, to realise just how powerful that can be.
chapter 5, I can control my emotions.
So this is the one area that I will get parents phoning saying, I cannot afford any more tennis rackets. You need to help my child. Or they're ruining things for themselves. They're hating it because they can't control their emotions on the pitch. What can we do?
Well, before you carry on, you're talking to somebody who got 3 golf clubs stuck up a tree once. So
That's impressive.
That was the most impressive moment of my career. That's what I'd put in my. I'll put it in my angry jar. Let's just say that. Anyway, tell me what I should have done.
So, as I said, I steal the ideas of Steve Peters here, or not the ideas. We all use that same discussion around amygdala, but I love the idea of it being a chimp, a physical thing that we can imagine, and we can have that conversation with, and it can be quite a fun way of using it because you can start to really help the athlete distance themselves from those unhelpful thoughts, those very emotional thoughts when they're feeling threatened. And one thing I think is really valuable when you learn this for sport, it translates beautifully across to the rest of life. And so when you understand what's going on and why you are threatened by certain things and how you tend to behave when those happen and what goes on in your body and how it's this kind of circular element that is just very difficult to get out of, it makes life so much easier to handle better. So, and when I do workshops with schools, I will give them a list of titles, often taken from this book of these kind of themes. This is always the one they come back with first, saying, we want emotional control. Because we know when the kids can handle this better, they can do anything better. And it's a much nicer environment for them all to be in. So we literally get them to name their chimp. Sometimes we'll ask them to draw them. We look at all the things that tend to trigger it. And we're quite clear on things like tiredness will trigger you so much quicker. Hunger will trigger you. And in some sports, that's a really big issue. I recently had a rowing cox who's like, yeah, but I have to focus on my weight. And we really have that. I work a lot in endurance sports where people are very focused on weight. And they're in this cycle of, I know I need to fuel my brain in order to think clearly, but I also have to constantly be focused on my weight. And it's a really difficult area to be in because that can cause some really big long-term issues. So I am constantly trying to get people to fuel their brain effectively.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then also, particularly for juniors, I find unfairness in life tends to trigger them a lot, particularly in tennis, because they often won't have umpires judging. They'll be making their own line calls. And so the unfairness that goes with some of that can really, really make people upset and angry and not behave in a way that they would love to. So to help it, we talk a lot about different elements of self-talk. So thought stopping and reframing to really help you feel a little bit more in control of your chimp.
I love it. The unfairness of the ball bouncing into the trees was, I think, my one, or the ball lipping out was my catalyst, I think. And obviously, you know, what we know now in brain science, don't we, or what seems to have shone through is this notion of, that intelligent part of the brain wiring up to the emotional part of the brain. I need to be careful what I say now about the intelligent and emotional side, because when we had Lisa Feldman Barrett on the Sports Psych show, the neuroscientist, she talked about the triune brain being a myth and how we don't have 3 parts to our brain. So I go onto autopilot and start talking about the intelligent part and the emotional part and the wiring up, but my understanding is that teenage brains are different to adult brains. Let's just say that.
Yes. Yeah, and I love watching their faces when you tell them that, because they're like, there's a reason I behave like this and my dad is wrong.
Absolutely. Hey, look, you start chapter 6 by saying, concentrate, focus, pay attention. All words likely to have been yelled by our coaches at some point. I've definitely heard those words. I think across the board we need to get better at helping players of all levels, of all ages, I suppose, learn how to focus better, because it's attention, concentration, such key skills that go hand in hand. So how do you help young people concentrate better, Josie? What do you talk about in this chapter?
One of the stats I found when researching this area, I found fascinating, in that as a junior, we can usually concentrate for about 2.5 times our age,
Okay.
which helps me severely as a parent because I've got a 4-year-old, and after 10 minutes, she is off doing the next thing. And you worry, like, why can't she do anything for more 10 minutes? And you learn that stat and you're like, that's perfect.
Yes.
That makes sense. And actually, for kind of some 8-9-year-olds, if they're playing 45 minutes, an hour of sport, that's asking a huge amount of them to focus for all that time. And I, to be honest, before I started in sports psychology, I knew very, very little about golf. And then I ended up spending some time on the course with people. And you're like, how on earth are you supposed to concentrate for 4 hours? And similarly, I do Ironman triathlon. I can't concentrate for 11, 12 hours back to back. So actually what we do spend a lot of time on is helping people switch on and off. So you're not trying to push them to concentrate for all of that amount of time, but just on and off so that they can do it when they need to.
Absolutely. So I love the fact you've talked about focus shifting, the Robert Nidifer stuff, internal, external, broad, narrow. And I love that because you're introducing some I suppose slightly higher, what can feel slightly more complex stuff for a younger audience, but you do so in a really accessible way here, Josie, and it's fun to read, and well, I suppose accessible is the word, very accessible for teenagers. So is that something that when you work with teens that you actually do find yourself moving on to? It's some of the more complex stuff there, like around attentional shifting?
Yeah, if it's something that they're really struggling with.
Yeah.
So it's not kind of a go-to technique we would teach. If a parent comes and says, I want my kid to make it to the Olympics, I want them to know all the sports psychology techniques there are.
Yeah.
We wouldn't necessarily pick those. But if that is an area they are really struggling with, and certainly if it's been pulled out by a coach, they're things we'll really focus on. And in some sports, it's much more helpful. So we really will look at that.
Now, the next chapter, I Can Bounce Back. Such an important chapter. Tell me a little bit about that, because I just think as especially young participants, competitors, they can get themselves into a bit of a hole and find it a real challenge to bounce back. So, talk to me a little bit about that.
See, I don't tend to get people when they're injured. But when they've had setback after setback and they've got to that just utter level of frustration and am I ever going to make it back? And every time I seem to get back on the race course or on the pitch, something else goes wrong. There's not only the annoyance that they can't do what they love, they've lost the coping mechanism for the stress that it's causing. And there's that huge amount of uncontrollability that we really struggle with. So there's so many frustrations there. So in the book, we teach them things like progressive muscle relaxation that can kind of help you handle it better. But I also tend to work from a 6-step process, particularly when you've gone through injury, but sometimes with setbacks, of you are allowed 48 hours when it happens to throw all your toys out the pram, to stamp your feet, be incredibly stressed about it, get angry. But then we start being more productive. So then we're looking at, okay, go and research everything you can about the situation you are in. Go and become the expert on it. Go and Google everything out of it. And then we're going to find the experts that are going to help you. Who's going to make you understand that better? Who's going to be, is it a physio you need? Is it an osteopath? Is it a psychologist? What do you need to help handle that? And then we goal set. So you feel like you're in control of it. This is where I want to get back to. This is what I'm going to need to do along the way. Then we really help you try and stay social. because there's some great research on how kind of keeping social really helps. So that might be still going down the track if you're injured, but helping the coaches, but you've still got those connections. And then we also look at what else is important to you. So I will often say to athletes, you know, those sticks of rock you get at the beach that have got the name of the beach written in them. If we snapped you in half, would it just say tennis player? Would it just say footballer? Would it just say runner the whole way through? Because if it does, that's not a healthy place to be. There's too many risks that come with that. And so we want other things in your life. Do you love baking? Do you love computer games? Do you love movies? What else can we bring into you? And that comes into one of the later chapters as well, of really making sure your self-identity is much wider than just being an athlete.
Well, we spoke on the Sports Site show to somebody who I believe is a good friend of yours, Rebecca Symes,
Yep.
about athletic identity. So we had a really good hour-long chat about athletic identity. And as you've mentioned there, really those, I think it's the last couple of chapters, I can belong and I can feel like an athlete. You know, both of these chapters feel like they belong together essentially, and very much cover that piece of who am I, my identity, and social identity as well. So do you want to talk a little bit to finish off the podcast here, Josie, in terms of I can belong and I can feel like an athlete?
So I can belong is really about how do you pull together your support team. And I think athletes are really lucky in this fact. I work a lot with people on the stage and actors. And I really feel for them because when you say, like, who's your support team? They're like, I've got an agent, but that's it. They athletes, if you're headed for good things, you've got a coach, you might have a team manager, you've got physio, you've got strength and conditioning, you've got nutritionists, you've got all of us psychologists that you can pull in. Other areas of life, we don't have that. So when we do have it, we absolutely have to use it. But occasionally, some of those people can cause more harm than good. And it's never, as I've seen, maliciously. It's just having different perspectives on what matters. And so some of the things we were talking about earlier with parents and what do parents say after they finished a competition or before they finished a competition, what's going to be helpful. And so in the book, we almost have a tick list of this is what I would like my parents to do before or afterwards. And all the parenting experts I've spoken to who work with parents of athletes are very clear. Before they go and compete, the only thing you should really be saying to them is, I love watching you play. Don't give them advice. Don't give them tips. Don't tell them what you did when you played 30 years ago. Just say, I love watching you play. Because they want a parent. They don't want an extra coach. And so a lot of this chapter is how do you communicate with your coach? How do you get what you need from your parents? How do you feel like you've got all the support that you can get? And then the final chapter, probably the one that matters most to me, and the more work I do with any age, is on who are you, what are your values, what's your purpose in life? And I really feel when you understand those better, everything else is easier. All the tricky decisions you have to make in life become so much easier because you can always move towards your values. And it has to be a small step, but you can always move closer towards those. You can judge everything with, does this fit my purpose? And I will use this with any age, that when we've worked on those, every decision you've got coming up, you can do it with, does it fit my purpose? Does it meet one of my values? Do I have the capacity to do it properly? Because actually, a lot of people I'm working with are high achievers who could take on far, far more than they should because they've got the ability to do it, but do you have the capacity to do it? And will I enjoy it? And you're not going to hit all of those all of the time. But the more of those you can hit, the better decisions you can make. And so life just feels much more purposeful and much more authentically you. And that puts everything else into a much better structure.
Values, purpose, and enjoyment.
Yeah.
Am I going to enjoy this? Does it fit in with my purpose? Does it meet a value of mine?
And do I have capacity to do it properly? Because I think one of the books that occasionally you get a light bulb moment book,
Yep.
and there was a book called Essentialism that I wish I could just stick under my pillow and let everything seep into my head. I love it. But the theme behind it is that when you say yes to everything, you actually end up saying no to the things that matter, because you never leave yourself the headspace to go and focus on what's really important. You end up almost living by everybody else's requests and structures. You don't forge your own path. And so you have to be incredibly brave to say no to more things that don't meet your purpose, your values, or your enjoyment, so that you can go off and find the things that will. And so I think that point about capacity as well is really important. We don't overload ourselves with stuff because it doesn't give us the space to go and do what matters.
So when you say the ability to do it, you're talking about capacity more than competence, or both?
I tend to find the people that come to see me usually have the competence, but they're overloaded.
Okay.
Because when you have the competence, when you're a high achiever, there are lots of opportunities that come to you. And it takes a very brave person to risk saying no to one of them, particularly if you're, say, building a small business, or you're a young athlete and you don't know whether you'll get that opportunity again. You kind of want to say yes just in case it never comes up again. But that doesn't give you the mental headspace to focus and to go off and find the right opportunities for you. So for a young athlete, if they get a scholarship offer from a university, you could see they might desperately want to take it. It might not be the right offer for them. They might end up miserable for 4 years because they've got a coach that is focused on entirely different things than them. Or it's a routine that doesn't work, or it's the wrong side of the US and they're gonna be able to come home far less often. And so the younger you can understand what matters to you, what's your purpose and your values, the better decisions you can make.
Do you think, have you found values and purpose shift over time? And I suppose I ask that question considering that I, I can see that purpose can shift over time in accordance to what's going on in your world and as you grow and who comes into your life. Values, do you think there's quite a bit of stability over the lifespan with values?
Yes, I tend to find that they remain fairly strong. Purpose, I think, remains fairly strong if it's a wide enough purpose, but the goals that will help you reach that purpose will change all the time because you might well achieve something. I think one of the strongest purposes I've seen was a young athlete who their purpose was to be a professional in their sport, to show other young girls it was possible. And that was beautiful as a purpose because it had something that they were going to achieve, but for others. And so it really drove them. It didn't feel selfish, but it would mean if you were too nervous to go and speak to a coach because that's not your personality type, actually you were up for speaking for the coach because you could see why it mattered in the bigger picture. And so the purpose bit was so powerful. There'll be different goals that come in and out of it. But getting more girls into that sport because it's a brilliant sport and they would thrive from it was a very powerful purpose.
So you mentioned personality there. If I have a tendency towards introversion, or I have a tendency towards shyness, which is more negative emotion, neuroticism, what I'm hearing you say is essentially things like values, purpose. You mentioned goals, um, competence or growing competence, capability, time, things like that. These are the kind of the adaptations that you'll work on with somebody in order to help them become a little bit more assertive, so a little bit more
Yeah.
extroverted in when they need to be, help them become a little less shy, a little less withdrawn, a little bit more approach towards engage in approach behaviors. That's what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, spot on. When we know why it matters to us and it's important enough to matter to us, we will do things that make us feel uncomfortable.
And they might remain uncomfortable, but
it's okay because it matters. And that's why I spend so much time with all athletes on find the metrics that matter to you and try and move away from scores and winning and PB times. What matters to you, what connects to your values. And it becomes really circular because something I've really noticed is when we know our values, when someone disrupts those values, that's what tends to trigger our chimp. That's when we lose emotional control.
When we move away from those overt, explicit metrics onto more controllable intrinsic factors, then we can become more adaptable.
Yeah. And I definitely, when I started out in sports psychology, jumped on the kind of the mental toughness bandwagon because it sounded really easy to sell and who doesn't want to be mentally tough? And the longer I work in it, the more I realise that actually I think mental agility is much more valuable, because if we can slip and slide and move with what's necessary to get what matters to us, that's much more powerful.
I've found that when we need to be tough-minded, if that's what we're going to call it, rather than tender-minded, it's that agility, that capacity to flex is what's required.
Yeah.
I just sometimes wonder if mental toughness it's something you can learn to do rather than something that you are necessarily.
And you can learn to do it if it really, really matters for what you're trying to achieve. And we will, if that's what really matters, we'll do that. But actually mental agility to be so much more flexible means we don't get stuck on certain things. We're able to move and to flex, and just be so much more adaptable to whatever is required. That usually means we just feel more comfortable with what we do. And particularly in sport is, I have to remind people so often, but sport's supposed to be fun. I know thousands of us, millions of us, our livelihoods depend on it. And we get huge amounts of entertainment from it. But it's very basics. It should be fun. It should be enjoyable. And when all of that is stripped out and there's no joy left, it's yet another stressor that people have to deal with. And that can't be right.
Wow, and it limits flex, it limits agility, and subsequently it limits performance and outcome. So paradoxically, through an insistence on perhaps high performance and winning, you actually limit high performance and winning.
Yeah.
Because, as you say, it can potentially become joyless, and subsequently, when it's joyless, you lack the capacity to flex.
Yes. And in kids, you drop out.
And as an adult, you can drop out.
Yeah.
Cool. Nice little deep dive at the end there.
Yeah, sorry.
No, I like it.
My area that really gets me going.
Yeah, no, I love it. And I think that the more conversations we have like this, the more that people consider these kind of conversations, these kind of intrinsic factors, the more they'll get that the external stuff more often than not just takes care of itself.
Yeah.
But it's a very scary place to reside, I think, sometimes, especially, your book is obviously about teenage sport, but at the adult elite level, the professional level, it can be a scary place to reside, but it's often the optimal place to reside.
Yes.
Thank you. Got me thinking there at the end. Brilliant stuff. So firstly, Josie, your book, I Can, The Teenage Athlete's Guide to Mental Fitness. Where can people buy that from?
So it's Amazon, Waterstones, any good bookshop. If they buy it from my website, I've got a little pack I've been sending out with it, with some physical stuff that people can do. Some kind of an activity I call Stars in the Dark, which is a strengths-based activity. So that's on my website, which is performanceinmind.co.uk.
And how can people find you? I know you're big on Twitter. So what's your Twitter handle and any other social media?
Yeah, I spend far too much time on Twitter. So it's at Josephine Perry. I'm also on LinkedIn at Josephine Perry 76. And yeah, on my website, performanceinmind.co.uk, I've got lots of free worksheets. So ones I use with athletes anyway. And then lots of blog posts on different areas of sports psychology.
Awesome. Josie, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.